What quality do you admire most in athletes, competitors, and coaches? Kindness. All right.
That's it.
That's it. Next question. Do you see a time when the mental aspects of what we do, i.e. understanding ego better and meditation, are more openly discussed and taught? No. And let me explain that a little further. One of the things I don't like about yoga, and I want to put a little disclaimer in here, I really like yoga. I think it's good for people. My wife is a yoga instructor. Kisa Davison, a core elder of our gym and one of my friends, she's a great yoga instructor. Both of them have a lot to offer. A yoga instructor can give you a lot of great things. But one of the things that has frustrated them as yoga instructors, and one of the things that has frustrated me over the years and in times past when I was more involved with that kind of culture, is the whole dissolve the ego, let's meditate, spiritual umbrella. It can very much be a trap, where it becomes an ego trap for the yoga instructor, it becomes an ego trap for the students, and everybody winds up sitting around talking about how spiritual they are. And the truth is, what really matters is how you treat other human beings, how you treat yourself. Are you healthy? Are you in loving relationships? Are you kind, genuinely kind? That's what matters. We have our resume virtues and we have our eulogy virtues, as David Brooks says, and you need both. And I think you develop those eulogy virtues through relationship with other human beings. And we don't need to sit around and talk about spiritual this or spiritual that. Meditation, yes, can absolutely play a great role in your life and as a competitor. Do I do it? I absolutely do. Am I going to spend a lot of time talking about it? I'm not. If I'm talking to a particular competitor that needs it or wants it, or I'm asked about it in the gym, or I decide even some of the coaches have done it for a few minutes to teach people how to do it during their classes, I think that's great. But I think you have to be very, very careful when you start talking about this, by the way, this goes the same for people who get too involved in pop psychology and anytime, the whole self-help thing. You have to be very, very careful with that, because it is an ego trap for everybody involved. It's unnecessary to talk about it. If you're in a healthy community and you're training jiu-jitsu and you're having a good, healthy role and you're on the mat with good people, you know as well as I do what that feels like when that's over and you're sitting next to your training partner and you're both sweating and you both had this honest physical communication with each other, the sense of trust that you both have to give each other, because you're rolling and you're both trying to choke each other or break each other's arms, and one of you is going to wind up in a position where the other one could do it to you, but it doesn't concern you in the least. In fact, you're both smiling and full of joy afterwards. We don't need to talk about all the things that means, because you experience what that means every time you do it. All right? Next one. I'm going to ask you to go back in time and recall a moment, situation, circumstance that involved your personal decision to not do any more live boxing sparring. Was there any correlation with your first daughter or marriage? Interesting question. I never stopped doing live sparring. I still occasionally do live sparring. I stopped certainly probably 10 years ago putting boxing gloves on and boxing anything other than very light at all. I mean, very light. Two reasons. One, I didn't really feel a need to do that anymore. I boxed when I was younger. But two, and this is the big one, I'm very concerned about traumatic brain injury, and all of the evidence and all the science is coming out. It just reinforces the fact that it's really not good for you to get hit in the head, whether it's with a ball or playing football or boxing. Am I going to let my sons and daughters. I have 5 kids. Do I want any of them to box? I do not. Do I want any of them to fight MMA? I do not. If they came to me and they really wanted to do it and it was true, something they really wanted, would I support them? 100%. I would support them and I would coach them to the best of my ability, and more than that, I would put them in the hands of the other SBG coaches who are much better at that job than I am, and I would trust them with what matters most to me, which is my children. And that tells you a lot about how much trust I have in our MMA coaches like Kavanaugh and Carl and Chris Conley and Adam. But barring that true desire, do I want them boxing? Absolutely not. What we know about brain damage right now is pretty much set in stone. So how do we manage then? How do we navigate teaching people to fight stand-up? I think you have to experience what it's like for somebody to really be trying to knock you unconscious with their hands a few times. I do. If you're very serious about self-defense, learning how to fight, that's necessary. It's almost like I would even qualify it as it's like a necessary evil. Once that's done, that's done. And from that point forward, you want to do as much learning as possible on the mitts or with very light sparring. And our coaches are great about that. John Kavanaugh's talked about that a lot. In fact, the term he uses, which is brilliant, is that you want to update the software without damaging the hardware. And I watched, when I was just in Alabama a few months ago, Chris Conley coach his comp team. They're making contact, their timing and their distance is right on the money, but nobody's getting clocked, nobody's getting a concussion. They know how to train. That's a real art. And so finding a stand-up coach or an MMA coach who's gifted at that is hard. And those guys are like gold right now. They're rare. You're not going to find that in an old school boxing gym. But if you find it, hang on to it and learn it. And if you can't find it and you're learning stand-up yourself, go to those guys and try and at forefront of your mind at all times, understand the nature of traumatic brain injury and gear your training towards being as realistic as possible without allowing that to happen to your students. How has your opinion on striking training for your coaches and athletes evolved? I think, that goes back to everything I just said. The biggest evolution, one of the things I think back on, one of my biggest mistakes as a coach, and when I look back on it now, and I look back on how we trained 18 years ago, 17 years ago, it really does make me cringe with how hard we went, how hard they went with each other, how much contact was being made. I didn't know back then what I know now about traumatic brain injury, but there was enough information that I feel like I should have known better. But that was kind of the standard at the time. My only exposure to stand-up training was what I saw the JKD guys do, which was usually, the distance was wrong and it was all about collecting focus mitt patterns, which I didn't want to go that route. It left a very bad taste in my mouth. And my training at pro-am boxing gyms, and in pro-am boxing gyms, you box and you put on headgear and you hit each other. So that's the background that I came from. But I would never go back to that now. And if I could get in a time machine and go back and not do that with any of my students and instead try and make that timing and distance proper on focus mitts, and when they were going with each other, keep it to regular MMA gloves and keep the contact really limited to the head, I would do that. So. Going back in time, do you remember a moment, situation, circumstance that influenced your decision to become more public about your views on politics and religion? Why do you think it was worth the risk of alienating possible students? Why do you think it worked out so well? Okay. Reiterate what I said before. I take very seriously the fact that when I'm teaching a class at my gym or I'm traveling to do a seminar somewhere else in the country or in the world, people have taken time away from their family, precious time off, because most people have full-time jobs, and to take an entire weekend off and give it to me on the mat and pay good money to have me teach martial arts. So I would feel unprofessional and a bit ashamed of myself if I use that time to get on a soapbox and talk about religion and politics. So I do not do that. I don't do it in the gym either. The only place people are going to hear about views I have about religion or politics is if they're going to read something I've written online, because I do occasionally write about those topics. I did more so in the past. Now I'm too busy, but there are essays and things about my beliefs there. And there I would hope they would just separate me as a professional martial arts instructor and whatever my views are on those topics. And like I said earlier, I don't think they matter in establishing meaningful relationships with my friends and my students. Some of the men I respect the most, when I look back and I think about all the people I know in the organization, and here's a measurement I would use. Who would I trust with my daughters? If something happened and I said, listen, man, I have to take off, I have to fly overseas, whatever it is, take my 5-year-old and 8-year-old daughter and you take care of them for a week. And I would get on a plane and I'd have no worry about whether or not they were being taken care of or that anything was going to happen to them. And I think about the men who I would entrust with that. Some of them have very different religious views from me. One of the people I admire the most as a father and who I would absolutely trust with my kids is a strong, born-again Christian. And does that make any difference? Absolutely not. At the end of the day, he and I share, I think, values about what matters in raising kids. And so is it a big deal that he believes in a creator God and I don't? I don't think so. I hope he doesn't feel that way. SBG, again, to reiterate, we have people of all religions and no religions, all political affiliations. Nobody cares. One of the best things about what we do is when you get on the mat and you're rolling or you're training, nobody knows. Not only do they not know if you're a Republican or Democrat or Christian or Muslim or atheist or whatever. They don't even know, unless they know you personally, they don't even know what you do for a living, what your income level is. You'll have doctors rolling with construction workers and police officers rolling with professors and students rolling with stay-at-home moms, and nobody cares, because when we're on the mat, it's a perfect meritocratic environment where everybody's trusting each other and learning and growing together. And to me, that's a beautiful thing, and I don't want to spoil that by, trying to make it political. And the last part of that question is, why do you think it worked out so well? I assume by that statement that you mean, why do we have so many great people in SBG? And that is the thing I'm most proud of. The level of coaches and human beings that we have is the thing I think I'm most proud of about the organization. And it didn't work out well. It didn't work out that way because I talk about religion and politics. It worked out that way because we share values that are deeper. It worked out that way because we share those values and we care about each other. That's why it worked out that way. All right. Elaborate on why the name Straight Blast Gym. That's a question I get asked a lot. So when I was making the transition from Jeet Kune Do to opening up my own school, at the time, all the martial arts schools, there was no really such thing as an MMA school at that time. There was no MMA schools in Oregon. There was no Brazilian Jiu-jitsu schools in Oregon. And all the Jeet Kune Do schools at the time were called Academy or Institute or something like that. And I would see these books of Japanese professional fighters, and they would be training in a gym-like environment, wearing sweatshirts and covered in sweat and doing takedowns and leg locks. And I was like, that's the kind of training I want to do. And to me, that was a gym. So I intentionally wanted to use the word gym as opposed to the institute or academy, because I wanted to differentiate myself from that and say, this is not a place where you're going to come and we're going to have a bullshit conversation and you're going to collect, I'm going to show you 6 different patterns you didn't know before, and you're going to write them down in a book, and then I'm going to give you a certificate, and then we're going to walk and get lunch and nobody's broke a sweat. This is the kind of place where you're going to come and your ego is going to be challenged and my ego is going to be challenged, and we're going to get thrown and we're going to get hit and we're going to sweat, and it's a gym. So that was the first part. It needed to be named gym. And then Straight Blast is just kind of a nod to our Jeet Kune Do roots, because the straight blast is one of the few movements in JKD that I kept. It's a kind of a running forward punch. It was modified. We modified it very early on, and it became more of a boxing style blast, like you would see Vitor Belfort use in the early UFCs. But it's still part of the movement, and it was kind of a homage, if you will, to Jeet Kune Do. So when you put it together, straight blast gym, to me that represented what we were doing. We're going to take this curriculum and we're going to use it in a gym environment, and we're going to see what's left, we're going to see what's true, and we're going to train that way together. And that's why I came up with that name. And over the years, it's been, everybody now knows the acronym, and thanks to the fantastic work of people like Carl and John Kavanaugh, more than anybody else, with his spectacular athletes, everybody around the world knows SBG, but Straight Blast Gym is where it came from. Hello, Matt. Podcast is awesome. Thank you very much. I hope to one day have the SBG experience in person. I hope so too. I look forward to meeting you. Question: why doesn't combat sports training sometimes not translate in a fight outside the gym? And then he goes on with a story about one of his friends who was an MMA fighter and did boxing and Muay Thai for years and found himself getting hurt in a street fight outside of a bar while he was a doorman. And it goes on to say, have you encountered this in your years of coaching? If so, how do you teach your students to prepare for it and get past it? He's talking about the difference between training in a cage, fighting in a cage, and fighting in the street. To be adaptable and efficient on the tarmac as they would be on the mat. Okay, so that's a good question, and more than any other question, this is the question I get asked the most. I know from speaking to my fellow SBG peers, it's the question the other coaches get asked the most. It comes in various forms, but essentially what we're dealing with is street versus sport. And so let me give the best answers I can to this topic, because this is probably the most misunderstood aspect of what we do. First of all, I'll begin with a quote from old school SBG coach Paul Sharp, which is kind of funny but also kind of true. And what he says is, if you can't beat us with rules, what makes you think you can beat us without rules? And there's a little bit of humor there, but the first thing that's about is a little bit of humility, right? So I'm going to tell, years ago, a long time ago, I was in a bar with Randy Couture, and there was a little back and forth with a drunk guy, and words were spoken, and he went away, and everything was good. But I remember at that moment, I looked over at Randy, and I was asking him these kind of questions. And I was, a young man, and I was like, what are your thoughts on street fighting, and have you been in a lot of street fights, and those kind of questions. And I remember Randy looked at me in a kind of a smirk and said, I'm not much of a street fighter. And I had been in a few altercations around that time. And I remember I had spoken to other coaches and students about those altercations and kind of used those as a reference or experience that I would talk about during my classes. And from that day to now, and that was probably 20 years ago, I do not talk about street fighting in that way. Because the moment that Randy said that to me, I felt a bit ashamed. Because here I was talking about dealing with one or two drunk guys outside a bar, which is usually what the circumstance was. And here's a guy that's getting in a cage with Kevin Randleman. And so he's dealing with a strong, fast, professional fighter who knows how to fight, and I'm dealing with two drunk assholes. And there's no comparison at all. And so that kind of instilled some instant humility in me and gave me some perspective where I understood a little more about levels of fighting. And here's the point. If you get in a fight outside and some guy grabs you and takes you down to the ground, it doesn't matter if there's one or two of them. He's holding you down on the ground, the other guy's kicking you, whatever it is, and you find yourself, for example, in a headlock, which is probably the most common thing people do in fights when they take you down to the ground as human beings. The escape that you're going to need to execute when you have that big, strong guy holding you down and trying to punch you while his friends are all over, that escape doesn't change because you're in a parking lot and there's 2 or 3 guys. It doesn't all of a sudden modify. That escape is the same escape that you're going to use in the gym, in training every day. It's the same escape you're going to use at the Pan Ams and the IBJJF tournament. It's the same escape you're going to use in the cage in an MMA fight, okay? The core delivery system and the core movements, the root movements of fighting, escaping and holding positions, delivering powerful strikes, defending against powerful strikes, being able to move to get off the X, to be able to orient yourself in space, to be able to put objects between you and another person. All that stuff, you train every day. Controlling the hands, knowing where the hands are in a fight, wrestling, clinch, push and pull, being able to control a weapon arm. We do that stuff every single day we train. Hand fighting, clinch. We do it with the real pressure. We do it with people who are actually resisting, and we develop those skills. Those skills don't magically change because it's a fight. Tactics might change. You might have to be aware of different things. You might have to be aware of different circumstances and elements that are now in the equation. For example, if you're a police officer and you're using your jiu-jitsu to control a suspect and cuff them, which they do all the time, and I now also have to be aware of the fact that you have a sidearm and you have other things on your person that the other person can grab. You have to be aware of your circumstances. So you might, the way you choose to use jiu-jitsu might change a little bit. Your perspective on and your tactics might change a little bit, but the core skill and root movements you're doing, those don't change. And so circumstances change and plans will change on contact, and the circumstances will dictate the tactics that we use, but the core root movement skills of the delivery system do not change. And so you have coaches who focus solely and who specialize in, for example, training law enforcement. Luis Gutierrez has been doing that along with Paul Sharp, decades now. And they take the same curriculum that we teach and they show it in a short, crash course for officers that incorporates all the other things they have to be aware of and the tools on their back belt and what the suspect may or may not have on their person. All that stuff is in the equation. But the root skills, they're the same, right? They're the same. So the street versus sport aspect is very much a fallacy. There is another whole other level of information that comes into play when you're talking about real-world self-defense, by which I mean defending your person in the street against somebody who might have intentions of really seriously harming or killing you or hurting your family. Avoiding those circumstances, knowing how to avoid those circumstances, knowing how to predict when those circumstances will happen or see them in advance so you can orient yourself in such a way that you're safe and get away from the threat, preferably, or at least have a strategic advantage that you might not otherwise have if you didn't observe it earlier in time, is very important. And that information is something that we will talk about more. I plan on talking about more, and for the last 4 years I've been working on a book specifically about that topic. But one of the most important things I try to explain to people is when all that is said and done, and when you've done the best you can to protect yourself and to avoid those circumstances, and it turns physical. The push, pull, escape, hold, punch, hit, animal physical contact of a fight is what we do every day in the gym. It's what we do every day in the gym. And the skills you develop every day in the gym on the mat, they will be there, and that is what's going to save your life. So yes, we need to address all that information. Yes, we've had coaches for decades who've addressed all that information. I mentioned Paul Sharp and Lewis as 2 examples, but there's Ray Price, there's many others. And yes, I will talk more about that as the months and years progress. And we're going to talk about specific maturity, which is the most important thing when it comes to avoiding violence, by which I mean a level of self-awareness, empathy, and impulse control. We're going to talk about intelligence, by which I mean not only IQ, which is also a great predictor of violence, but your ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to be clever. Those 2 things are far more important than anything else. Then we're going to talk about being able to notice what's going on around you at a given time, what you need to look for and not look for, like pre-incident indicators, the kind of things you'd hear from Gavin DeBecker, which is usually the person I recommend people read. Because with a solid background in combat sports, a real combat sport like boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and read The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker, you've got a good background there to defend yourself. And once you get past that, maturity, intelligence, and noticing what's going on around you, then we're into the D part of it, which is de-escalation, deterrence, and if last case circumstances, determination to finish that fight and make sure you're the one that gets to go home. And when it does turn physical, like I said, everything you've done in the gym for years, that's what's going to save your life. Because those skills don't change magically when it becomes a parking lot instead of a mat. The first thing I want you to get out of this curriculum is a measurable increase in your performance in closed guard bottom. Let's get right into it. From the bottom, just like everything else, I'm going to use something my coach Chris Howder taught me, which is how to use my weight, how to use your weight from bottom so that you can make their head explode. So I'm pulling his neck into that choke, so I have maximum surface area. And as I open my legs, this one really does most of the motion for me. He gets pretty good base. Watch until he gets to the point where he breaks. Good. Broke the line. And now watch how little movement it takes. I'm gonna bring one hand to the other, and this one comes underneath. And then I can pull that across. Okay, so he's gonna put his hands there, and I'm just gonna go here. A very common thing here is to kind of want to bend your body like this, bend your spine, to grab the neck, to grab the gi, do whatever. But now he's in a weak position. He's gonna roll those shoulders back and just close his eyes and focus on keeping his shoulders down and making his body one unit. And now Kane goes to lift, making it difficult for Travis even to stand. Beautiful. Nice. All the way there. Yes, beautiful. Now once here, pull your elbow up back. Right. We want to treat it like a position, so I pull. I feel him bringing it back. I climb, right? And I hug. So now between my legs and this, it's hard for him to get his arm back. Get your arm back. And then this just becomes a nice, gentle figure four. Now you'll see his hand is also trapped. Both those are very quick, and there are many, many, many more. The next thing I hope you get from it is you get a little better understanding of how jiu-jitsu works by seeing the fundamentals broken down. Instead of taking the back here, Travis wants to work the elevator sweep. So first thing is pinch the knees together tight, and he pushes Kane's hips away. And while keeping this pressure, keeping his hips away, he repummels for a butterfly hook. Right? And that's real important, go back. Because what will happen is beginners, you can teach them to push the hips away, but when they go to put the hook in, they release the pressure, and then they can't get the foot in, okay? So this is a good skill. Push this away, now put the foot in. Good, then you move your hips out to the side a little bit, and you'll notice Travis has confirmed the grip. He just wants to make sure Kane keeps his arm there. He's gonna move now to get onto his left shoulder, and then as he sweeps him, he's gonna extend Kane's elbow. Go ahead. Right, which takes away the post that Kane would have. So first thing is, just to survive, right, I'm pushing his hips away a little bit. And then I wanna confirm the grip. I don't want him to move his arm. His arm's in a good spot for me. So I hold. And then instead of pushing the arm this way, I just move my body that way. And then I lock it up for my finish. Good back take. Nice, heavy leg. There we go. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna grab the rope where I can grab it. I'm gonna begin with my pinky. I'm gonna hang on like that, and I've swung my body here. Now I'm gonna swing my body to the other side, and I'm gonna take a little bit higher grip, and I'm gonna go here. And now I'm gonna swing my body to the other side, and I'm gonna take a little bit higher grip, and I'm gonna go here. You hang on to him, Justin. Don't let him go. Yes, good. Fine. Now, as he goes to sit you up, put this foot on the mat, put the toes on the mat, and put your weight on the toes. Sit straight up. And then lock it back up. You feel Josh go to do it again? Yes, then lock it back up. Go to do it again, lock it back up. Okay? I would still avoid people that can do that.
Well, if you wind up with one, then that's what you need to do.
And then the last thing I hope you get from it is a training method. You'll see not just the techniques, but also how we drill those techniques so that you can get the most important thing there is in jiu-jitsu, which is timing.